Good afternoon, this is AlanTheFriesen, AlanTheFriesen.com. I'm going to be going through another poem today called The School Children. We're going to be going through the essay creation process from start to finish. The reason I'm doing two of these is that I'm actually testing out two different pieces of software. This is the second. I want to see which one works best for my use. So you get the benefit of two essays. Isn't that wonderful? So here we've got the poem The School Children by Louise Gluck. Now I've taught this poem before, so I know quite a bit about it. I've gone through the entire process of interpreting it, understanding it, so I'm going to be quote-unquote struggling a little bit less with this poem as I write this essay. But nevertheless, we're going to go through it and it's going to be a good time. So let me read it first. The School Children by Louise Gluck. The children go forward with their little satchels. And all morning the mothers have labored to gather the late apples, red and gold, like words of another language. And on the other shore are those who wait behind great desks to receive these offerings. How orderly they are, the nails on which the children hang their overcoats of blue or yellow wool. And the teachers shall instruct them in silence, and the mothers shall scour the orchards for a way out, drawing to themselves the gray limbs of the fruit trees bearing so little ammunition. There's a lot to do, or there's a lot happening in this poem that we can discuss. I'm going to draw your attention first of all to this example of enjambment here, on which the children hang their overcoats. So we have these children that are hanging on nails. Oh, no, wait, it's actually their overcoats that are hanging. This deliberate example of enjambment is designed so that when we read this, we think that the children are hanging, but they're not. It's their overcoats. So children hanging on nails. This sounds like an allusion to Christ. Likewise, we have offerings. So people who are waiting beyond the other shore to receive offerings. So we've got this idea of children being sacrificed to teachers. We have some language here, the military language, right? So we've got words that are associated with the military. We've got satchels, going forward, labor. We have other shore, thinking of, crossing a shore in order to fight, to go to combat. We have overcoats. We have ammunition. I mean, all these words that are associated with military. And likewise, we could go through the entire poem again and look at words to do with sacrifice. But what I want to be doing, I think, with this essay is I'm going to be discussing power and, what was I going to go with? Power and silence in this poem. You'll note that the only time when there's actually a noise, actually any speaking here, is when the teachers are instructing. And even this line is ambiguous in terms of noise. The teachers shall instruct them in silence. So they're instructing the children, but the construction of the sentence is ambiguous. We don't know whether the children are being silent, they're being instructed in silence, or whether the teachers are instructing in silence. That is, they're not actually speaking as they talk. And of course, power. There's a very clear power structure, power conflict between the parents, between the mothers specifically, and the teachers, with the children who are caught in the middle. So if I were to create an argument then, or an exploration of this topic of power and silence, I might have something to do with, let's see here, Thesis describes the power conflict between mothers and teachers, a conflict largely born out in silence. So I've got a thesis, but the question is, why is it important that it's silent? Usually if a poem is missing some sort of one of the tactile senses, they usually emphasizes something else, right? So everything here is silent, except perhaps the teachers who are instructing in silence. We're going to need to deal with the ambiguity of that line, certainly. But maybe if everything else is silent and we assume that the teachers are instructing, they're speaking, then perhaps their power comes through words, whereas the power of the other characters, the other people in the poem, is lacking because they don't have a voice. So maybe the thesis might be different then. In the poem, the only speakers are the teachers. This indicates their power over the mothers and the children who have no voice. Okay, let's actually go with that. That sounds a little bit better. So if this is our thesis, then we need some sort of structure for our essay. So we could talk about, first of all, we could talk about the mothers and how they give their children to the teachers, how they labor to gather apples, and I guess we could talk about the ambiguity of the sacrifice. Apples or students. And then they are at the very end, they are scouring the orchards for a way out. Indicates unhappiness. And then the teachers, in contrast, they wait behind great desks to receive offerings, and they have students hang their overcoats on nails, and then we're going to deal with the enjambment here. And then finally we have the teachers instructing the children in silence, and we got to deal with the ambiguity of that line. And maybe that's enough. I think that one other section that I might have wanted to put in was the idea of the children, how they're caught in the middle. Maybe I'll leave that for a concluding paragraph or conclusion. So once again, what I'm using is a program called Q10. If you Google that, you'll be able to find it very easily. I like to use this sort of minimalistic word processor so that I don't have all the distractions and all the fanciness, unnecessary features of Word as I'm writing. I just want to focus on my writing. And then, once I'm done writing, once I've proofread it, what I'll do is I'll take everything in here, I'll copy it over to Microsoft Word, and then I'll format it according to MLA style, and I'll make sure it's all double-spaced and all that fun little stuff. All right, so here we go. First thing I forgot to do, of course, was put in line numbers. Now, it's not like you have to do this, but it just makes it a lot simpler at the very beginning if you can look at the line numbers right away. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the introduction for now. This is what I advise my students to do. I say, come up with a thesis, write your body paragraphs, then write your intro and your conclusion later. It makes it a lot easier for students to focus on this and to polish everything off before they worry about the introduction, the flowery stuff that comes at the very beginning. So we're starting off by talking about mothers. So thesis. In the poem, the only speakers are the teachers. This indicates their power over the mothers and the children who have no voice. It is clear that the mothers have no voice as they physically do not speak anywhere in the poem. So I'm taking the thesis here and I'm making this topic sentence very clearly related to the thesis. So in the first stanza, the mothers labor to gather the late apples, and this is on lines 2 to 3. And later in the fourth stanza, the mothers scour the orchards for a way out, drawing to themselves the gray limbs of the fruit trees, bearing so little ammunition. Now the only reason I'm including all this is to show that they're not actually speaking here. So this is 14 to 16. They gather apples and look for a way out without so much of a mention of any speech, acts, or even noise. When their children go to school, mothers say nothing. Let's actually do furthermore. Furthermore, when the children go to school, the mothers say nothing. This might actually work better at the beginning because chronologically it goes first. So in the first stanza, when their children go to school, the mothers say nothing. Later in that stanza, the mothers... Yeah, that looks good. The mothers labor to gather like apples. Okay, so they gather apples and look for a way out without so much of a mention of any speech acts or even noise. This is awkward. We're going to leave that for now and we'll come back. Well, we got to deal with somehow about the power issue, right? So they give their... From the last stanza... But why do they look for a way out? Are they unhappy? When they draw the limbs of the trees to themselves, we can't help but think that they're imagining their children, their absent children, that have been given to the school in the first stanza. But of course, okay, so when they draw the limbs of the trees to themselves, we can't help but think that they're imagining their absent children that have been given to the school in the first stanza. If their children were with them, then it stands to reason they would be embracing them rather than trees. It's clear then that they're deeply unhappy and that they're looking for a way out, but without any power, they are unable to do so. And let's see if I've dealt with what I wanted to deal with here. So, give their children to the teachers. Yep, we talked about that. Labor to gather orchards, or to gather apples. Okay. And then scouring the orchards for a way out indicates unhappiness. So, we've got our ideas here. What I'll do is I'll just split up this paragraph. It doesn't need to be quite so long. That looks a little bit better. But without any power, they are unable to do so. The teachers, on the other hand, quite obviously have the power in this poem. They wait, and that's line 6, for the students. In contrast to the mothers who labor, that's 2, and scour the orchards for a way out, and that's line 14. It seems as if the teachers' lives are quite a bit easier than the mothers' lives. So this is plural possessive, the lives that belong to the mothers. So it's S and then an apostrophe after that. Moreover, they receive offering. Is it offerings? Yes, offerings. Offerings on line 7. In the previous stanza, the mothers are picking apples. So it's entirely possible that the offerings are in fact apples, as this is a traditional gift for teachers. On the other hand, when thinking about the word offering and with children associated with this offering, it's possible that this is an allusion to, and this is going to sound weird, but to child sacrifice. The story of Abraham and Isaac as an example. The mothers are unhappy, looking for a way out because their children are no longer theirs. Now, we need to explain what this means. It's not that the teachers own them, but that perhaps they're being educated in a way that goes contrary to what the mothers might want. Notice the reference here to like words of another language. So the apples are like words of another language, but it also implies that the mothers are speaking a different language as well. But we'll get back to that. They have the power in this poem. They wait for the students, and moreover, the teachers require that the students listen to them in silence, and that is line 12. Now this line is somewhat ambiguous. The wording of the line could indicate that the teachers themselves are instructing without speaking, but this seems very unusual, even within the context of the poem. It makes more sense to interpret this line as the silence of students rather than the silence of both students and teachers. When we think, so then, with this in mind, when we think of a classroom where the students are completely silent, we get a picture of fear, of intimidation. I teach, obviously, which is the reason that I'm doing this. I cannot remember the last time that I've had a class that's been entirely silent. And the only time that that's happened is perhaps a very early morning class with a great bunch of grade 11 or 12 students who have perhaps been undertaking some interesting activities the night before, perhaps in the bush, perhaps drinking various beverages that they probably should not, in which case they're very quiet. And I tend to be really loud because that really annoys them. But generally speaking, students in my classes, and in most classes in my school, there's people talking, they're rustling around. So the fact that this entire class and these students are being instructed in silence, it certainly does have a negative connotation to it. Or at the very least, a highly traditional teaching model where students are absolutely silent, where they fear their teachers and where they put up their hands whenever they've got a question. Oh, for those days again. No, I'm kidding. Wouldn't trade it for anything. So we get a picture of fear, of intimidation. Let's go back to what I was reading here. To interpret this line is the silence. So the teachers are able to speak because they have power, whereas the students are unable to do so because they are powerless. Okay, so I've dealt with waiting behind desks. I've dealt with teachers instructing children in silence. I've dealt with giving their children. I've given the ambiguity, and they're indicating on their way out. I haven't talked about the overcoats on nails, about the sacrifice. And I don't think I'm going to do that because that brings us a little bit, that brings us away from the thesis, which is power over their mothers and children who have no voice. We've talked about sacrifice, but we're not going to go into the Christian allusions here. So I think that we're going to leave that one out. Moreover, the teachers require, okay, so then what we're going to do is, I think we've clearly shown that the teachers have power in this poem because they have a voice, and the mothers and children do not have a voice and therefore have no power. So I'm going to copy her last name so I can get the umlaut in there. Gluck's the school children then is an illustration of the power conflict between teachers and parents with students caught in the middle. Now, we're specifically talking about mothers here, so let's make that specific. Is an illustration of the power conflict between unable to speak. The mothers are unable to voice their concerns as their children go off and are taught by the intimidating teachers. And likewise, the children have no voice as they go forward to school. Let's put a line number there. To be taught in silence. Now, what does this matter? I tell students, and I'm somewhat flippant about this, but I say, why should I care about your little argument? What does this all matter? So perhaps Gluck is illustrating, no, we talked about illustrating, is concerned about the state of education in the United States. Gluck is American, and she wrote this in the 90s. A system in which children have very little say in their education. Likewise, such a system discourages parental involvement. Teachers then do what they want in their classrooms, and such a state is seemingly alarming to Gluck. What's the way out? The mothers in this poem haven't found one yet. And given what's happening in recent years in education, it seems as if the United States hasn't found a way out yet either. Okay, conclude. Let's take this out. Then what I need to make sure I do is introduce the poem. So, Louise Gluck's, not dower, but we want the idea of depressing. So I'll just put that and come back to it. Poem. The school children looks at a group of students who leave their mothers and go to school. A picture that is reenacted every September in schools around the globe. Now, I know that not every school starts in September or every fall or whatnot. Some schools start in January, but we're going to go with it. Every fall in schools around the globe. This is typically portrayed as a time of jubilation for parents. A recent television commercial depicts a smiling and laughing father and mother as they gather school supplies for their children, who follow them dourly behind. This attitude is the attitude of the children in the poem certainly reflects the attitude of these children in the advertisement, but the parents' glee is nowhere to be found in the school children. indeed, and we got to transition somehow to silence, right? Indeed, the parents, specifically the mothers, are as silent as the children. In the poem, the only speakers are the teachers. This indicates their power over the mothers and children who have no voice. So here we've got a longer introduction than we've seen before. We could make it shorter. We could say Louise Gluck's poem, The School Children, concerns three groups and their concerns the power relationships between three groups. Mothers who are voiceless, students, mothers who are voiceless, students forced to attend school without a word of protest, and teachers who are the only group who not only receive the students from the mothers, but teach in silence. This silence, in fact, reflects the power of the teachers over the mothers. In this poem, I'm just looking at my old thesis here. In this poem, the mothers and children have no voice and are thus powerless, while the teachers are the only actors who speak and therefore have power over the other two groups. So we have two different introductions here. This is very straightforward and to the point. This one has it talks a little bit more about the television commercial. So it's a little bit of a juxtaposition between media portrayals and reality. Both of these are fine. It's not like you need to pick one or the other, but this initial one is something that you'd be more expected to see in university, where profs are fairly impatient. They're like, okay, just get to the introduction, get through it, and then move on to your body paragraphs, which is the main point. Whereas in high school, especially in the diploma exams, teachers who mark like to see this sort of hook, this sort of interesting introduction. So for today, well, I don't know. What do I feel like? I feel more like a university professor today. So I'm actually going to cut this out and I'll put it at the bottom. And when I publish it, I'll make sure that I leave it at the very bottom of it someplace. All right, so we've got our poem here. We've got an essay. What we're going to do is we're going to copy. So I selected it all, and I'm going to do Control C. Then I'm going to load up Word, Control V, and again the Control T to make sure that it's just the text. Now this is quite a bit shorter than the last essay. It's 678 words, which is fine. We'll go with it for now. Okay, so we need to make sure that everything, first of all, is double spaced. Now, it's important to note that some versions of Word, that when they start up, they'll actually look like this. When you copy it into it, it'll look like this. So what you need to make sure you do is everything needs to be 2.0 double spaced. And if it says anywhere remove space, you need to make sure that you click that. So this is what it should look like. It should be a 2.0. It should say add space and add space. These are saying, hey, do you want to add spaces before or after the paragraph? We don't want to, so we're going to leave those unchecked. And just as before, we're going to call this one Rebecca student, and this is English 20-1. This is your prof's name, and then the due date, 15 November 2013. And then title. I liked Power and Silence in Gluck's or The School Children. And I think I want to have something like scouring the orchards for a way out. Power and Silence in Gluck's The School Children. Yeah, that looks like a good title. And let's not forget to put a page number, top of the page, write justified, and student 1, so that it'll show up student 1, student 2, student 3 page numbers. And the proofreading. Here we go. Louise Gluck's poem, The School Children, concerns the power relationships between 3 groups. Mothers who are voiceless, students forced to attend school without a word of protest, without perhaps being able to voice a word of protest. It seems like they don't have even the power to speak. And teachers who not only receive the students from their mothers, but force the students to learn in silence. This silence, in fact, reflects the power of the teachers over the mothers. In this poem, the mothers and children have no voice and are thus powerless, while the teachers are the only actors who speak and therefore have power over the other 2 groups. Okay, this is a little awkward. While the teachers are the only actors who speak and thus have all the power in the poem and therefore assert their power over their charges and their guardians. Okay, that sounds good. It is clear that the mothers have no voice, as they physically do not speak anywhere in the poem, as it's impossible for somebody to speak within a poem. That's like taking a piece of paper with a poem written on it and trying to speak. I'm holding up a piece of paper to my mouth to speak through a poem, which is not possible. So, as the poem does not mention, as the poem does not show that they speak, as there is no reference to any speech acts made by them in the poem. Okay. In the first stanza, when their children go to school, the mothers say nothing. So this might not be unusual, but as we will see later, the mothers send their children to school despite misgivings about the entire scenario. We talk about how they're unhappy later on. Later in that stanza, the mothers labor to gather the late apples. And later in the 4th stanza, the mothers scour the orchards for a way out, drawing to themselves the gray limbs of the fruit trees bearing so little ammunition, 14 to 16. What I was tripping over is this, later in that stanza and later in the 4th stanza. It sounds repetitive. So finally, in the 4th stanza, so that sounds a little bit less repetitive, they gather apples and look for a way out without so much of a mention of any speech acts or any even noise. I didn't like this before. Without so much as a peep. Without so much as a peep. And, okay, but why do they look for a way out? Does their silence indicate unhappiness? When they draw the limbs of the trees to themselves, and we need to, okay, and that's 15. We can't help but think that they're imagining their absent children who have been given to the school in the 1st stanza. If their children were with them, then it stands. If their children were with them, then it stands to reason. No, you don't need both. If their children were with them, it stands to reason, they would be embracing them rather than trees. It's clear, then, that they're deeply unhappy and that they're looking for a way out, but without any power, they are unable to do so. But being powerless, they are unable to do so. Okay. The teachers, on the other hand, quite obviously have the power in this poem. They wait for the students, in contrast to the mothers who labor and scour the orchards for a way out. It seems as if the teachers' lives are quite a bit easier than the mothers. Moreover, they receive offerings. In the previous stanza, the mothers are picking apples, so it's entirely possible that the offerings are in fact apples, comma, a traditional gift for teachers. On the other hand, when thinking about the word offering, and with children associated with this offering, it's possible that this is an allusion to child sacrifice, the story of Abraham and Isaac, as an example. The mothers are unhappy, looking for a way out, because their children are no longer theirs, just as Abraham was unhappy when God asked him to sacrifice his child to the Lord. So we've very quickly talked about this illusion and talked about this possibility. I think that within the context of the poem, the sacrifice or the offerings are likely the students, but because because of the ambiguity there, and because this is a very short and timed in-class essay, we're not going to go into a lot of depth in the ambiguity. Oh, my color scheme changed. That's cool. Okay. Moreover, the teachers require that the students listen to them in silence. Now, this line is somewhat ambiguous. The wording of the line could indicate that the teachers themselves are instructing without speaking, but this seems very odd, even within the context of the poem. It makes more sense to interpret this line as the silence of students rather than the silence of both students and teachers. With this in mind, when we think of a classroom where the teachers are completely silent, we get a picture of fear, of intimidation. The teachers are able to speak because they have power, whereas the students are unable to do so because they are relatively powerless. It's not that they have zero power, it's just that in the context of a classroom, these particular students feel like they do not have power to do anything else. And then we move to the conclusion. Gluck's The School Children, then, is an illustration of the power conflict between teachers and mothers, with students caught in the middle, unable to speak. The reason I paused again was because I was thinking, well, should I add something about the silent mothers and the silent students, and then the not silent teachers? But then I deal with it in the next line. Unable to speak, the mothers are unable to voice their concerns. I have the unable here and unable. Voiceless? Voiceless. The mothers are unable to convey their concerns as their children go off and are taught by the intimidating teachers, and likewise the children have no voice as they go forward to school to be taught in silence. Perhaps Gluck is concerned about the state of education in the United States, a system in which children have very little say in their education. This is true. Likewise, such a system discourages parental involvement. Except, I should mention, except when after school or getting homework done. But even the idea of homework, when a student comes home with homework, it's assumed that they need to do it, and that it's implicitly assumed that the teachers are asking the parents to help out. Otherwise, there's calls made home and all that. So in this system, it's clear that the that the mothers don't have power. Parents don't have power in the United States. Now, this is not universally true, but since we're talking about our guest that she might be concerned about the state of education, then we can go with it and we can say, yeah, okay, this will work. Teachers then do what they want in the classrooms, and such a state is seemingly alarming to Gluck. What's the way out? The mothers in this poem haven't found one yet, and given what's happening in recent years in education, it seems as if the United States hasn't yet found a way out either. Okay. I'm looking at this conclusion here and this very political sort of discussion. This is something that a teacher would write, or somebody who knows a lot about education would write. I'm not entirely certain that a student might write this. So I'm thinking here, to be taught in silence. What would a student write? Students often feel that they have no voice in school, and perhaps this is what Gluck is trying to convey. We could see this poem as a call to action. Students should stand up for their rights to be able to choose the path of their own education, and parents should be assisting them by perhaps looking for a way out. This is an idealistic view of the future of education. And I want to say but it doesn't look good because, okay, no, let's say, an overly idealistic view of the future of education, perhaps, but one that's eminently preferable to the silence and intimidation within contemporary schools as depicted in the poem. Okay, that's something that students might write. So let's put here alternate conclusion, and I want to drag the other one back out from here. I want to add this. So copy that, cute word, and we've got alternate introduction. Of course, students who are reading this, you would never include any of these alternate stuff. You wouldn't say, hey, teacher, you could have a choice between this and this. Yeah, don't do that. But this is for the people who are watching us at home and want to actually take a look at what I've written because they like it or because they're interested in it or whatnot. Okay. So then what we do is we save as, just like before. We're going to call this power and silence in Gluck's The School Children. And that's our word, editable copy. Just like before, we're going to go to save as type, PDF, and we're also going to save it as a PDF so that we can send this to our teacher. Oh, I forgot to do something. I forgot to spell check. Let's see. I'm going to press F7. That's okay. That's okay. Conflict. Oh, Mr. Friesen. Change that. That's okay. So what I'll have to do again is save it. And then I'm going to export it again as a PDF. Save as PDF. And I will just save it just like this. And I will replace the existing file because of that mistake. So there we go. We've gone through the entire process of creating another essay based on Gluck's The School Children. This is AlanTheFriesen, AlanTheFriesen.com. No, AlanTheFriesen, thefriesen.com, YouTube username AlanTheFriesen. Thanks very much for watching. Have a wonderful day.